Hello everyone, here we are for the presentation on a topic, Preface to Lyrical Ballads, an overview. At first, I would like to discuss on the outline of the discussion. First, focus is on introduction to Preface to Lyrical Ballads, aim of William Wordsworth in Preface to Lyrical Ballads, the dominant theme, poetic diction, function of poetry, poet's characteristics, the process of poetic creation, demerits of preface, values and significance of preface, and finally we come to the conclusion. The first is the introduction. Now you see that the Preface to Lyrical Ballads was a volume of poems which was first issued anonymously by Wordsworth and Coleridge in 1798. Now both the poets believed that verse stripped of high literary contrivance and written in the language of the lower and middle classes could express the fundamental of human nature. For some critics, Wordsworth's preface has gained the status of a manifesto for British Romanticism, laying out the core principles of that literary movement. And the first volume was published in 1798, where Wordsworth briefly stated the main points of his argument. The second edition was published in 1800 with many poems and with more detailed preface, the detailed document of the entire theory of poetry, and in 1802 it was revised and expanded with the significant additions about the definition of the poet and the value of poetry. That means what the poet wanted to contribute towards the formation of the definition of a poet, how he wanted to bring a change in the definition of a poet from the neoclassical period. Like he wanted to bring a difference here from the neoclassical period. The next slide, we have the aim of William Wordsworth. Now, why Wordsworth wrote Preface to Lyrical Ballads? Now, the preface is an ex-revolutionary critical document from a poet deeply imbued with a sense of mission to free poetry from the hackneyed and the critical style or the artificial style of writing. It is rather designed to make an authentic expression of sincere feeling, mode of experience. In Preface to Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth is inaugurating a new era of poetry. It is rather a preamble to the Romantic movement in English literature. Now, it was a revolt against what? The artificial poetic diction popular in the age. Now, why this artificial poetic diction? We have to look back to the neoclassical period. After the Puritan period, Dryden emerges in the literary field when Charles II was ascended to the throne in 1660. With that, Dryden appears in English literature. After Dryden comes Alexander Pope. Now, what we find in the neoclassical period, in the age of Dryden, we find satirical elements in the poem. And it was heroic couplet, the mock epic style that was popular in that period. And what we find in that period is more emphasis given to prose, reason and the rational element. Fancy, imagination, nature was not so much popular in the themes of poetry. So what Wordsworth tried to do in Preface to Lyrical Ballads, he wanted to revolt against this artificial poetic diction popular in the age. He revolts against the neoclassical poetic style, and thus he wants to introduce a new form of poetry. According to him, the aim of the poet is to free poetry from this artificial style of writing. And so he introduces the language of the common man in the poetry. His poetry deals with the natural descriptions, the valuable knowledge of nature and the language of the ordinary people. So it is very simple in its form, but with a lot to give to the readers. So what we see here is Wordsworth's another objective of writing the preface is he felt that since his poems were of a new kind, both in theme and style, he should not force the readers directly to read the poems. Rather, he wanted to give an introduction to his poems, so that when his readers try to read the poem, they read the introduction first and try to understand the main perception of the poems. His poems, as we know, it's a revolt against artificial poetic diction, and Wordsworth himself states that his intent to redefine poetry in a way that would make it more accessible and more interesting to common people. Thus, it should be read as Wordsworth's attempt to write poetry which is in the language of common man. Next, we come to the dominant theme, that is the poetic diction. Now, the very first point, you see that Wordsworth attacked the gaudiness and the inane phraseology of the contemporary poets. Now, what he says in his argument is that the question of diction is considered as primarily because of the feelings of the poet, and he feels that it must be easily conceived by the readers. He wants to say that his readers should easily conceive the feelings of the poet. He attacked the neoclassical poetic diction. And why did he attack the neoclassical poetic diction? Because it was mainly based on the classical poets such as Virgil, Spenser and Milton. Now, these poets used to write poetry using embellished language and particular decorum. He wanted to denounce such superficial and over-embellished language. He never wanted to separate poetry from ordinary speech, as he felt that it is separating poetry from human life. He wanted to write in a particularly about low and rustic life. I quote, low and rustic life. He wanted to write about these rustic people because he believed that the passion of such life is better expressed using the common language. See, he wanted to go back to nature, away from the artificial diction, and he wanted to express the language of the common people through his poems. He said that the great value of poetry is that it permits a sharing of experience. So, what is the poem trying to do, or what is the function of a poetry? The poetry is communicating truth. It cannot be detached from human values and perceptions. He wants to say that he has taken the help of lyric to discern in simple things the primary laws of our nature. And in the preface, we see that there is a forceful plea for simplicity both in theme and treatment. We can also say that it is a type of literature that a common man might have read and is written in the kind of language that he might have been accustomed. So, the next particular area that we are going to discuss is the function of poetry. Now, till now we have discussed about the aims and objectives of William Wordsworth in Preface to Lyrical Ballads, the dominant theme, that is the poetic diction, and now comes a function. So, what is the function of the poetry? In the earlier period, we have seen that it was mainly the satirical element that was popular. Mainly, the poets wanted to satirize the Puritan period because they were under the subjugation of the Puritan Revolution. England was under the subjugation of the Puritans for a long time. So, it was the revolution, the revolutionary spirit of the people could be perceived in the poems of the neoclassical period. Now, when we go to the function of poetry, we will see that the basic function of poetry is to give pleasure. And the traditional poets, they felt that the function of poetry was to give pleasure as well as to instruct. So, it was both pleasure and instruction that was imparted in the earlier poems. And in Wordsworth's poem we see it was mainly to give pleasure, because he wanted to establish a communication of the poet with nature. He wanted to bring the poet very close to nature. This close proximity gave a new dimension to his poems. Now, the serious poetry provides a pleasure of more exalted kind. It is a pleasure which results from increased knowledge and understanding. He considers poetry superior to history and philosophy as well as to science. Thus, we can say that in Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth tries to throw a challenge to the established traditions and as a return to more simplistic form of poetic diction in order to better explore human emotions and behaviors. So, his poetic diction was designed in such a way to explore different facets of human emotions. And the function of poetry is what? To give us a delight, to give us a pleasure. So, when we read the poems of William Wordsworth, we get a lot of pleasure in understanding the values of nature, how poet is trying to establish a communication with nature through the simple lines or by using the simple words from the common life. So, it brought radical literary change in the Romantic period. So, after considering the function of poetry, let us focus on the poet's characteristics. To write these kind of poems, Wordsworth, he felt that the poet should have some specific characteristics, and these characteristics which help them to understand the language of the rustic, and then the poet can express it in their beautiful language. So, the Wordsworth also gives us his view of nature and character of a poet under three categories. Point number 1, exceptionally sensitive with more lively sensibility and enthusiasm. So, the poet perceives everything, every single emotion he perceives with a lot of sensibility, and he reacts more strongly to external impressions, and so his emotions and passions are more powerful. It is the poem is taking birth in such strong emotions. Now, he means to say that he wanted to explore how one could attain profound truth and sublime emotional experiences via the imagination. So, it is only through imagination one can reach a sublime stage. One can understand the truth that is there in nature, that is there in human perceptions. In other words, this process is about understanding the extraordinary while experiencing the ordinary. So, you are trying to, according to Wordsworth, what he wants his readers to do is to read the poem and understand the ordinary, the extraordinary things through the ordinary lines or through the ordinary poetic lines. So, what is the function of the poet? Now, see here, the poet has to write in such a language where he can bring out the extraordinary things just by experiencing the ordinary. So, ordinary means the common people, the rustic people, the low and the rustic people, which he stated in the preface to Lyrical Ballads. And by understanding this low and rustic people, the poet can write something extraordinary. And this is the knowledge that we get from nature. According to Wordsworth, the poet is a man speaking to men. Now, this I have kept in quotation because it is taken from Preface to Lyrical Ballads, where Wordsworth says that his poet should be, within quotation, a man speaking to men. That is to say that poetry is not mere self-indulgence, and that the poet is a social being with some responsibility. So a great poet ought to rectify men's feelings, to give them new composition of feeling, to render their feelings more sane, pure and permanent. This he later developed in a doctrine. So this particular precept, which I will say Wordsworth has stated in Preface to Lyrical Ballads, I will say this as a specific statement of William Wordsworth, that he wants to develop it as a doctrine. He states that, I quote, "Every great poet is a teacher. I wish to be considered a teacher or as nothing." So Wordsworth states in Preface to Lyrical Ballads that he wants himself to be considered as a teacher or as nothing. He wants to impart knowledge to the readers through his poems. What kind of knowledge? The knowledge of the common people, the knowledge of nature, how one unites with nature, and what kind of solace one can get when one communicates with nature. This is what Wordsworth tries to portray through his poems. And thirdly, according to Wordsworth, the poet is endowed with an extraordinary strong imagination, so that he is affected by absent things as if they were present. So his imagination is so powerful that even if something is absent, is not present in front of him, he can visualize that and he can represent it in his poems. So his imagination level is to such an extent that he can go deep to nature and find out the essential truth of life. How life is with nature, the communication of life with nature. The poet with all these characteristics creates the poem. And here we focus on the poetic creation, how poems were developed by Wordsworth in the Romantic period. Now we all are aware with the specific term that Wordsworth stated in Preface to Lyrical Ballads, that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. So all good poetry is a spontaneous overflow of these powerful feelings. So poetry is equated with the rapid flow of emotion, and this involves intense mental as well as emotional activity. For Wordsworth, the process begins in a state of calm, with the remembering of some past emotional experience. So it is consciously contemplated and then calmly recollected. So Wordsworth consciously contemplates these emotions, the experiences that he has gathered, and then he says that in his poetic creation, this is being recollected in a state of mental poise, mental calmness, before being written into verse. So the poet has an experience and reflecting on it later. So at first the poet gets an experience and then the poet reflects it later. And in this way the poet can arrive at a deeper understanding about that experience and about the act of reflection. So about the experience that he has gathered and how he reflected on the experience and how he portrayed it in his poems. So this is all about the poetic creation. This is not just a method of poetic creation according to William Wordsworth. It is also Wordsworth's recommended method for experiencing general. So this is a general experience according to Wordsworth. This is how we need to perceive emotions in our life. And in this process of poetic creation, Wordsworth states that thought and emotion, conscious and the unconscious elements continue their intimate interaction till the beginning of the spontaneous overflow. So unless and until there is a spontaneous overflow of these powerful feelings, there is a continuous interaction, I would say intimate interaction in the mind of the poet, and this is how the poetic creation is successful. So it is a continuous interaction between the conscious and the unconscious elements, what the poet perceives and what the poet does not perceive. So these two emotions, they are continuously interacting with each other and finally giving shape to a poetic creation which the poet composes, in which helps the poet to compose the beautiful poems. So we see till now we have discussed about the objectives of Preface to Lyrical Ballads, the dominant theme of Preface to Lyrical Ballads, the function of poetry, what are the essential characteristics of the poet while writing such poems, and now we come to, and after that we also discussed about the poetic creation, how poetry is formed in the Romantic period, why this particular Preface to Lyrical Ballads is considered to be a preamble to the Romantic movement. What were the essential qualities of this Romantic movement we have studied till now? Now, we know that each and every literary document has got some kind of demerits in it, because there will be some kind of criticism of this preface, and that in the demerits you see that Coleridge criticized it for certain obscurities, certain elaboration, and for the constrained diction. Notable critic Derek Roper points out that the preface is not a tactful piece of writing. H. W. Garrott states that the preface suffers from the sin of exaggeration. Now, critic Berman suggests that the preface is open-ended, and so it is not surprising that it has given rise to numerous conflicting interpretations. So this is according to the critic Berman. But the interesting fact is, Wordsworth states that himself ends the preface by stating that it is a reader who will determine his success, and more importantly, whether success be worth attaining. So Wordsworth leaves it to the readers to understand the theory of Preface to Lyrical Ballads, because he never wanted his readers to go through the theory of poetry. He wanted to make a defense of what he stated in the Preface to Lyrical Ballads. He never wanted his readers to just go through the theory, but to understand the main concept that he lays down and how he revolts against the conventional process of writing poems. Next, we go to the values and significance of preface. So, after dealing with the demerits of preface, which we know that in the later, in due course when I will be delivering the other lectures on Preface to Lyrical Ballads, I would be focusing in details on the function of poetry, on the poetic diction, and also on the other aspects of it. And while discussing those, I will be discussing the demerits of the preface in details. Next, we go to the values and significance of preface. Now, since this critical document is there in the Romantic period, so there should be some significance or values attached with it. So, this is considered to be the most important single document in the history of literary criticism. Why it is considered to be? Because it's a vast document. It was published in 3 editions with several changes. There were a lot of criticisms, and it brought out the essence of poetry. And we know that in the Romantic period we get the beautiful poems, and it is a kind of period where we get to understand beauty. We get to understand nature. We get to understand that how there is a relation between nature and human beings. The essential relation between nature and human beings is what we try to understand in the Romantic period. And Wordsworth was successful to bring about the reforms he wanted. We see that in the Preface to Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth is revolting against the neoclassical period. He is revolting against the conventional, traditional poems, against the conventions of the poetry. So, he was quite successful to bring about the reforms that he wanted to bring in this particular literary genre. And it gave valuable insights to the nature, scope and function of poetry. First, it is the first comprehensive attempt to build up a theory of poetry. After considering all these aspects of poetry, let us come to the conclusion now. Because this is an overview where we have discussed about the different areas of preface to lyrical ballads, and now we are trying to sum up the entire discussion. In the first point, I would say that it emphasizes spontaneity and the expression of poet's personality, because spontaneity, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. This is the definition of poetry given by William Wordsworth. This is what he states about poetry. So that means it is emphasizing on the spontaneity and the expression of the poet's personality. Here, a poet is a man speaking to men. So why is a man speaking to men? Because he is talking about the language of the common people. He is trying to establish a relation with the low and the rustic people of the society, the low and the rustic people of the country. So the poet is trying to bring out the language of such poor people, such ordinary people who were not given a privilege in the earlier periods, whose voice was not there in the earlier period. And in the traditional poems, we did not find earlier that such rustic people could get a popular stage. So here we see that such rustic people could get a voice in the language of the poem. And the language of the poem should have a proximity with the language of the common men. The language of the poem here should have the language of the common people. So common people means the ordinary people of the country. So at the end, I would say it is an unofficial manifesto of the English Romantic movement. So thank you very much, and in due course you will be getting the lectures detailing about the other aspects of Preface to Lyrical Ballads.